as a way of generating random numbers, and the I Ching produces a rather exactly specified way of getting the random numbers, which I've forgotten at the moment. But Cage wanted a computer to be able to produce a sequence of I Ching statistical numbers, and so this turned out to be not too hard to program, and I did that for him, and it was interesting. And I saw him a fair bit, and Boulez and the other composers at IRCOM had great respect for him, and he came over to Paris once, and we saw each other. And at the near the very end of his life, he came out to Stanford, where a number of his paintings were exhibited. He really lived off of the proceeds of selling paintings rather than off of concerts, because paintings then, and as now, are much more highly paid for than music. He was very depressed at the time, and the lecture I went to, he was unable to finish. The thing that he said was depressing him was the growth of the population in the world, and what he felt was the terrible conditions that having too many people imposed on great regions of the world. And I guess I still share that concern that the environment is heavily stressed now by the human population, and it seems to continue to be worse and worse. Merce Cunningham was a close friend of Cage's, and I once asked a performer who knew both me and Cage, told her about Cage's last talk and his depression, and she was of the opinion that Cage was depressed not necessarily by population issues, but rather because he and Cunningham had just broken up as friends at that time. But I asked Cunningham if this was the case. He also came out to Stanford with his dance company a year or so ago. But he said no, that was not true, that he and John had never had a breakup. So I don't know who to believe. But I do know that Cage was exceedingly unhappy in his very few last days, and this was not typical of him. He otherwise was, I think, a very resilient man who could not only wasn't depressed, but could resist depressing situations in the world, or in the musical world.
Did you work with Bernstein after that?
No, I did not. I didn't work with him before that.
Okay, I guess.
I'm sure the feeling would have been mutual.
Yes, Max, could you tell me a little bit about some of the more current research that you've been conducting?
Well, my most recent research has concerned a slightly different kind of filter called a phasor filter that is better behaved when you dynamically change the parameters of the filter while at the same time passing a signal through the filter. These are single resonant filters. In engineering terms, they're described by a single pair of poles that produce a peak in the frequency response at the resonant frequency. So the two parameters controlling these filters are the resonant frequency and the decay time, or Q. Now, these are infinite impulse response filters, and various forms of them have been around for a long time. But the normal equations, now called biquad equations, which will produce two poles and a couple of arbitrary zeros if you want them, are not very well behaved if you suddenly change the frequency or the Q of the filter while at the same time passing a signal through it. So this often introduces a discontinuity or a click or some undesirable sound. Phasor filters are based on also a difference equation, but a slightly different and more complicated difference equation, so that the discontinuity introduced by changes in the parameters, by dynamic changes, is smaller than the discontinuity in normal biquad filters. The expense that you pay for this greater dynamic stability is that the resonant filters basically require twice as many multiplications to produce a resonance as the biquad filters. Today, computers are so fast that you can afford this additional computation time, so that the phasor filters, most any laptop today that runs with a processor speed of more than a gigahertz can simultaneously produce perhaps between 500 and 1,000 resonant filters. An example I've been working on recently is making a vibrato filter, where the vibrato is not the change in pitch of the driving function, the voice or whatever you're trying to put a vibrato on, but rather is a change in the resonant frequency of the resonance of the filter. And this change would occur at not auditory frequencies, but rather modulation frequencies, vibrato frequencies, 3 to perhaps 10 cycles per second. I and Julius Smith gave a paper on the resonant filters at a meeting in Stockholm, one of the SMAC meetings in 2003. Since then, I've been trying to get some interesting musical timbres out of these filters using a laptop platform to produce these timbres, and to get the whole thing to running in real time, so that this would eventually be a musical instrument that could perform live performances or be part of an orchestra or something like that.
Do you have any thoughts about alternative controllers and new control designs, it seems to me that there is rather a movement where musicians and engineers and just about anybody is building their own controller, and the technical aspects don't seem to be a hindrance, really, I think, but the musical results tend to be the problem in many cases. Any thoughts on this sort of phenomena or trend?
Yeah, this is a question we struggled with, particularly in our human-computer interface course, where the students actually build new instruments with all sorts of different sensors. Students are very, very imaginative at constructing new sensors. One person made a bicycle sensor where the music was controlled by the handlebars and the brakes and the pedal. It's easy to make these things and enjoyable. The class is very popular. Everything is exciting until the final presentation, where we ask the students to get some music out of their device, and they almost never succeed by my standards of what I like in music. There are almost always interesting sounds. I think that designing new controllers for controlling music is a very difficult field, because it takes so long for a performer to learn to play a new instrument. And the museums in the world are full of old instruments that no longer are made and no longer exist. Just lots of variations on violins or bassoons or reed instruments or keyboard instruments. So that the learning problem and the investment of time to test a new instrument is probably a decade, really, before you get very expressive on the instrument. And since in the end many of the promising ideas don't prove to be very successful, I don't know how to deal with this unpredictability of the real expressive qualities of new controllers, and how to shorten the learning process, and how to evaluate a controller to see that it really is expressive. The controller I've worked mostly with is the radio baton, and the thing that makes that playable is the fact that the score is in the computer memory, and so and you play it as a sequence, and so that removes one of the mechanical problems that performers on normal instruments, who have to select each note at the proper, usually rapid rate, have. But that also limits the kind of things that can be done with the, well, it's a radio baton and conductor program, this combination. It's not very good for jazz or improvisatory music. So I don't know in the end whether that will be a successful instrument, or whether it will also be relegated to the museums.
How do you think computer music will evolve in the near future and distant future?
I can tell you what I hope will happen.